news at Boeing. The Justice Department is not sleeping. The Justice Department is not sleeping. They are undeterred by SCOTUS's ruling against Trump. They're like, you know what? If we can't get Trump, we'll get Boeing. Kind of. Maybe not really. What's the deal?
I'm leaving on a jet plane.
Our continuing series of scaring the shit out of flyers. And hey, I would probably feel worse about this if I were not going to be flying more than any of you. So
right.
I am right there with you, and even more so because I'm looking at Southeast Asia and China next year. And if you're going to do that kind of trip, it's almost impossible to avoid flying on any Boeings. It's pretty much impossible. Like, they're just so widely distributed throughout airlines throughout the world. So just going to have to, I don't know. I don't know what saint you use for praying that your plane doesn't go down. We're going to have to talk to a Catholic about which medallion to wear around my neck for these flights.
Yeah.
DOJ to present Boeing with plea deal that families of 2018-2019 crash victims say fall short. The Department of Justice is preparing to present the Boeing company a plea deal that would again allow the aerospace giant to avoid a trial over an alleged conspiracy to defraud the United States, according to attorneys for families of victims of two fatal Boeing 737 MAX crashes who were briefed on the department's plan Sunday afternoon. Under the proposed deal, Boeing would be required to enter a guilty plea to the conspiracy charge, which was first filed January 2021, for allegedly misleading the FAA during its evaluation of the Boeing 737 MAX aircraft. The company must also agree to the appointment of an external corporate monitor, pay a fine of about $200 million, otherwise known in the business as lunch money, right, and remain on probation for 3 years, according to lawyers for the families. During the briefing with the DOJ, family members of the crash victims expressed dissatisfaction with the proposal, according to attorneys representing the families. They contend that the deal contains no accountability and no admission that Boeing's alleged conspiracy caused the deaths of 346 people who were killed in the two MAX crashes in 2018 and 2019. The victims' families have been pushing DOJ to take the company to trial and to impose fines upwards of $20 billion. Just briefly, for anyone who's not familiar, if you've ever seen Jaws, that's Dennis Muhlenberg is the mayor in Amity. Right. They knew these planes were not safe, and they let people fly on them anyway, even after they crashed. Forget about bringing Boeing to trial. I'm not a lawyer. I don't know what the rules are. I do know that in cases of extreme criminality, the corporate shield that protects executives from personal liability can be pierced. If ever there were a case where the CEO at Boeing and others who knew in the C-suite at Boeing that these planes were not safe and lied to the FAA about it, should be held personally liable in addition to whatever action they bring against the company.
Yeah, that guy's going to have to run for president. Get some of that.
He's going to have to run for president to get that immunity. Well, no,
it was an official act.
If you're a CEO, you do have this immunization from liability, but prosecutors can pierce it. Again, I'm not a lawyer. I don't know what the requirement is, but it seems to me if this is not a case where they're personally liable, what would be?
Right.
What would be? They put a plane in the air they knew wasn't safe and lied to the regulators about it to get it cleared.
Right.
And then kept flying it after the first one crashed. If that does not make you criminally liable, what would?
Right.
Quote, the Justice Department is preparing to offer to Boeing another sweetheart plea deal, wrote attorneys Robert Clifford and Paul Cassell in a statement. The deal will not acknowledge in any way that Boeing's crime killed 346 people. It also appears to rest on the idea that Boeing did not harm any victim. The families will strenuously object to this plea deal. Judge Reed O'Connor of the Northern District of Texas will have to decide whether this no accountability deal is in the public interest. Indeed, he will have to decide whether to approve an agreement that ties his hands at sentencing and prevents him from imposing any additional punishment or remedial measures. The memory of 346 innocents killed by Boeing demands more justice than this. Amen. Amen. I take a couple drinks, get in a car right now, and kill somebody. I'm going to jail for manslaughter.
Yep.
I have a friend who went to jail for manslaughter for that. These motherfuckers walk around free. According to the statement from Clifford and Cassell, quote, Glenn Leon, chief of the fraud section of the criminal division at the U.S. DOJ, told the group on the call that the DOJ hasn't shared the new plea agreement with Boeing, but would do so later Sunday. Leon admitted there is a strong interest by the families to go to trial, but he repeatedly said that the DOJ couldn't prove charges by a reasonable doubt. Families argued over and over for a trial and to allow a jury to make that decision, the statement said. And I think they're right. I don't think you could find a jury in the country that would not find them guilty, because I've seen the emails. There is an email, so-called, to use a figure of speech, paper trail, of them discussing the reality of the computer system.
Oh yeah. There's a lot of hard evidence. This is easier than like the Sackler case, and that's an easy case, and this is even easier than that.
Right. The idea that a jury would not find them guilty with the evidence that's available, bullshit. They just don't want to do it. Mark Lindquist, another attorney for crash victims' families, told ABC News that Boeing will be given until the July 7th deadline to accept the deal. If Boeing rejects the terms, the DOJ will pursue prosecution. Quote, the company would be absolutely brutalized in a highly public trial, Lindquist said. Boeing has way too much dirty laundry to risk the bright spotlight of a trial. The Department of Justice and Boeing declined to comment. Clifford and Cassell told the DOJ that the victims' families, quote, will be traveling from around the world to go to the next hearing before Judge O'Connor in Texas to fight this. The deferred prosecution agreement was put into place in the final days of the Trump administration when the DOJ charged Boeing in a criminal information indictment. That's this is a symptom of our declining idiocracy. You did not used to see as many mistakes in establishment
media,
press as you do now.
Yeah.
With one count of conspiracy to defraud the U.S. for allegedly misleading the FAA during the agency's evaluation of the new Boeing 737 MAX aircraft. Over 300 people died in the two MAX crashes, the first in Indonesia in October 2018 and the second 5 months later in Ethiopia. Just on a side note, part of what's really disgusting about this is they blamed the pilots with a kind of racist undertone that, those pilots from Indonesia.
Yeah. This is where
term,
people get this DEI shit from. This is where they get that. This is where they latch on to that, right? They try and make this, somehow about that instead of very, very obviously what this is.
Right. It's because it's that. Well, that's what they always do. They just, it's the same thing as with the minimum wage. They don't want to tell you that General Mills, one of the main players in our food supply, increased prices 20%, even as they were making billions, even as they were making record profits. They want to blame the fast food workers for the skyrocketing prices, right? And then get people really angry. God damn it, these fast food workers, and they'll never talk about what's happening at the top. They'll never talk about what's all the way upstream. They only want to talk about what's downstream among people with no money and no power. And that's by design. It's the same thing with this. You want to talk about these DEI programs? God knows I'm no fan of those. That's not what's happening here. This is a result of an industry that probably should not be subject to capitalist incentives, just like pharmaceuticals, just like medicine, just like media. But even if you believe in the invisible hand of the marketplace will create better products, even if you believe all the Adam Smith shit, even if you believe that, you have got to, if you are going to evaluate these things fairly, you have to admit there are certain things that doesn't work for, like the fire department, right? You would concede that that's an area where capitalist incentives don't work. In fact, I live in New York City, where we have a real world example of that. Fire departments used to be privatized in New York City. You know what happened? Eventually, they started setting fires so they could go put them out and get paid for it.
Right. Yeah, there you go.
Then they said, this isn't going to work. We had private police departments, one loyal to the Democrats and one loyal to the Republicans. They used to fight each other in New York. Very much like the street gangs. You had some that were Republican and some that were Democrat. If you see Gangs of New York, Leonardo DiCaprio, that was a real gang. Dead Rabbits, they would have been supporting Tammany Hall Democrats, and Butcher Bill, they would have been Republicans. Under the terms of that agreement, the DOJ fined Boeing $243.7 million and required the company to pay $1.77 billion in compensation to its airline customers and $500 million to the victims' beneficiaries. The company was also required to disclose any allegations of fraud, cooperate with the government, and avoid committing any felony offense. Under these conditions, the DOJ agreed to defer criminal prosecution for 3 years. But in May, 4 months after the door plug fell off Alaska Airlines Flight 1281 over Portland, Oregon, the DOJ informed Boeing that the company had failed to live up to its obligations under the DPA. It's the Deferred Prosecution Agreement. Quote, "We believe that we have honored the terms of that agreement and look forward to the opportunity to respond to the department on this issue," the company said in a statement in May. In a written statement, Javier de Luis, who lost his sister in the 2019 crash, called the deal inadequate. Quote, "The issue is not whether there should be trial versus a plea deal. The issue is that the penalties being proposed by the DOJ are totally inadequate, both from the perspective of accountability for the crimes committed and from the perspective of acting in the public interest by ensuring a change in Boeing's behavior. The penalties proposed here are essentially the same as those proposed under the previous DPA, which, as Alaska Air demonstrated, did nothing to increase the safety of the flying public." Exactly. Why are you going to offer them basically exactly the same deal when it didn't take the first time? And this is where a lot of the discussion around this is, do they just consider Boeing too big to prosecute, which clearly is the case. Clearly, that's what it is. If this were a corner bodega, they'd be prosecuting them because it's Boeing, and we've talked about this. And again, capitalism is supposed to create all of these competitors so that the best rise to the top. Well, that theory does not take into account barriers to entry. The barrier to entry in constructing jet planes that can carry hundreds of passengers is so high that you only have two companies that really do it, with a few minor players in the space that usually develop smaller, narrow body planes for shorter trips. But for these kind of big jumbo jets, you have Airbus and you have Boeing. That is a failing of capitalism. That is a failing of capitalism, that you are reduced to having these two companies and no competition to improve quality. Boeing partly was able to get this way because they have a virtual monopoly.
Right, because in order to build up something that is now a competitor to Boeing, what do you need? You need investment. Well, where are you going to get that investment from? The best investments, if you're an investor, are in the companies that already exist.
Right.
They're already there.
Right.
Why would you invest
why
in
would
any
you
other
risk a
company
new
for
startup?
Boeing? Why would you?
Yeah.
I mean, Boeing, they have contracts with the government. I mean, they have guaranteed revenue streams every time a war breaks out. Who would invest in a startup? So, yes, the barrier to entry is too high to even call it a real barrier, in the sense that it's not even surmountable, right? It's beyond an obstacle. These just become these giant behemoths, which is unhealthy as it is. Now you have them go rogue and start breaking the laws left and right. What do you do? There was the 2008 financial crisis. Too big to fail means too big to jail. Well, I even said that a few weeks ago when we covered one of the Boeing stories. That seems to be the case with these guys as well.
Right. Well, if suppose they bring the kinds of fines that Boeing really deserves, like billions, and you bankrupt Boeing, what do? The government would have to take over Boeing. Like, you could
Right.
not just let the capacity to manufacture airlines go away.
Exactly.
So the company would have to be preserved. It would have to be nationalized.
Yes, of course. I mean, that is the solution that's sort of hidden in plain sight. I agree.
Well, which is what I advocate for. I think
Right.
Boeing should be nationalized.
Please clap.